Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tim Keyes. Welcome to God Save the King. And as always, you can listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. All you have to do is go to their website, www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. And of course, there's plenty of other ways you can listen to the Truth Be Told radio network, and there's lots of other great shows on the Truth Be Told radio network as well. But tonight, God Save the King, every Friday at 10 p.m. So I kind of want to jump right into things tonight. For the past couple of sessions, we've been talking an awful lot about the background information, especially the Old Testament information that sets up the birth of Christ. Okay. Actually, we started out by discussing the chronology, right? The fundamental premise of God Save the King is the fact that Jesus was not born on December 25th. And we spent a significant amount of time looking at a bunch of the indicators that help us understand why he was not born on December 25th and when he actually was born. Okay. Now, then we took a little bit of a detour. And tonight, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to kind of bring some of these things together, both the chronology and some of the background information, because you really can't have one without the other. Because of the background information, when we look at the chronology, certain things make sense and certain things don't, okay? And where I want to try to get to tonight is I want to try to talk a little bit about John the Baptist, okay? Because John the Baptist was the forerunner of the Messiah, not only when they were adults as in their public ministry, but also when they were born, okay? So that's where I want to get to, but I want to start by try to briefly review what we've talked about in the past couple of episodes to get us up to speed and therefore start to tie these pieces together. So I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. If you need to, please feel free to go to my YouTube page. It's just called God Save the King, and go there and listen to the previous segments, the background about the Abrahamic Covenant, and then the background with regard to how we define religion. Because here's kind of a quick summary. When you look at the Abrahamic Covenant and you look at the fact that there are multiple conditions, but there are multiple conditions that break down into three convenient categories. Like we said, category number one is the descendant clause. God promised Abraham descendants. I will make of you a great nation. Number two, that's also known as the seed clause, the descendant clause or the seed clause. Okay. Number two is that he promised to give Abraham and his descendants a land to live in. Okay. So that's the land clause of the Abrahamic covenant. And then finally, God promised to give them a blessing, to make them a blessing and to bless them. Okay. And that is what is known as the blessing clause of the Abrahamic covenant. And then each of these clauses, each of these categories was then magnified and amplified by an additional covenant over the course of the Old Testament. Okay. So the seed clause was magnified by the Davidic covenant. The land clause was magnified by what is commonly known in scholastic circles as the Palestinian covenant, a label that I'm not very fond of, so I prefer to simply call it the covenant with the land. And then finally, the blessing clause is magnified and amplified by what is known as the new covenant. Okay, so the Davidic covenant was cut with David as the representative for the nation of Israel. The land covenant was cut with Moses as a representative for the nation of Israel. And then the new covenant was cut with Jesus of Nazareth as the legitimate representative for the nation of Israel. And then the culmination of the Abrahamic covenant, the final point that the entire world is waiting to see, is when all of these pieces of the puzzle come together at one time, that the descendants of Abraham are put in the land that God chose for them, and then God blesses them by indwelling them. So thereby fulfilling the descendant clause, the Davidic covenant, the um, land clause, the land covenant, and then the blessing clause, the new covenant. And they all come together as one in the messianic age. And this is very important to understand because this would have been in the DNA of every observant Jew leading up to the birth of Jesus Christ. So when we use the phrase messianic expectation, this is what we're talking about. It's not just the presence of the Messiah himself, but the fulfillment of the covenants made with Abraham. That it's an entirely new I don't want to use this phrase, but I'm going to. It's an entirely new world order, okay? That when the Messiah would show up, that he would fulfill these covenants. The nation of Israel would take its rightful place in the land, that God would indwell them and bless them, and also Israel would take its rightful place in the world as a blessing to all nations. Okay, now that's the background of the Abrahamic covenant, and it really focuses on the nation of Israel. Now, in another segment, we talked about the definition of religion. And although I did not connect it at the time, this really has much more to do with the Mosaic covenant. Okay, now the Mosaic covenant is not a prophetic covenant in the same way that the Abrahamic covenant is. The Abrahamic covenant is waiting to be fulfilled. The Mosaic covenant, I really don't want to open a can of worms here, but I kind of have to, has, for all practical purposes, it has been fulfilled. Okay. Now we may see components of it again during the Messianic age. Okay. Components of it, but it really has been fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. And that is critical to our understanding of both the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant, is that all of these things pointed towards Jesus Christ. And we're, like I said, I'm going to try to tie these pieces together tonight a little more, because our understanding of what the Jews would have been expecting, plus all of the types and shadows that pointed to Jesus. Okay. And what I mean by types and shadows is, let's quickly review the definition of religion, right? That the Jewish religion had a sacred space, a geophysical sacred space that was set apart and different from all other common or ordinary spaces. And this is where religious activity would take place and where the people would, quote unquote, meet with God, right? And there were several different sacred spaces, but the penultimate one, of course, is the temple in Jerusalem, the outer court, then the holy place, then the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, and the mercy seat. Okay. So you've got, pardon me here, the geophysical sacred space. So then, in addition to the sacred space, you had the holy man. Okay. You've got the religious official, right? So in the Old Testament, you had the Levites, and then you had the priests, and then you had the high priest. That's the holy man, right? Then you had the sacred code. The sacred code would have been the Torah, right? And the Tanakh, right? The law, the prophets, and the writings, okay? The Torah, and then the Tanakh. And then you would have had the sacred ritual. And as I said before, there's lots of things that would qualify as sacred ritual, but we're going to focus on one that plays a huge role and makes a great example, which is the religious calendar. Okay, and the religious calendar is definitely going to come into play a little later on today. possibly in ways that we don't fully expect. But then again, maybe we should be expecting them. And then finally, there is the blood sacrifice. And the way the system of atonement would work in ancient Israel is that you had personal atonement and then you had corporate atonement. The corporate atonement is what we'll focus on for the moment, which is that the high priest would perform the blood sacrifice in the sacred space on the holy day according to the provisions of the sacred code. And that is how the system of atonement worked. Now, the one huge key to understanding this in the big picture, and a huge key to understanding um, the birth of Jesus Christ and the environment that would have existed, is the fact that every one of these components points explicitly at Jesus Christ. Because when he came and performed his public ministry, he stated of himself that he is the temple of God. So that's the whole point of the Old Testament tabernacle and the Old Testament temple, the outer court, the holy place, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant. Everything was that an observant Jew would have been able to practice those components. And then when the Messiah shows up to go, oh my word, that's got to be him. That's got to be him because he is the flesh and blood fulfillment of these symbolic elements that we have been practicing for, hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? Likewise, the same goes true for the priesthood, that the Levites, the priests, and the high priests all pointed towards Jesus of Nazareth as the ultimate high priest, the high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And now that's in contrast to the order of Aaron, but that's kind of the point, is that he is an eternal high priest. Okay. Then you have the sacred code, the Torah, right? And the Tanakh, and the fact that an observant Jew would have read the Torah, understood the Torah, and then when the Messiah showed up, and you are told that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, you couldn't help but notice that that was referring to a man, and that it's referring to the Messiah, right? So all these things are intended so that the people of Israel would recognize the Messiah when he came. So this is the environment, right? And then, of course, you've got the holy day, right? And the fact that you had all different manner of holy days in the Old Testament. The fact that you had weekly Sabbath, that you had a monthly Sabbath every seventh month, right? You had a sabbatical year, and then you had the 7 annual feasts, the 7 Mosaic feasts prescribed under the law of Moses that every able-bodied male had to deal with, or 7 feasts, but then the 3 required feasts that every able-bodied male had to attend. And then, of course, you had the blood sacrifice itself, and the fact that John the Baptist, who we're going to look at today, explicitly said, "Behold the Lamb of God." So any observant Jew should have known and understood that when John the Baptist said that, when he said, "Behold the Lamb of God," he's not talking about a generic definition of a lamb as an innocent animal. He's talking about the Lamb of God, the Messiah of Israel, chosen as a sacrifice for Israel and frankly for all mankind. Okay. So this background, the background of the Abrahamic covenant, the background of the Mosaic covenant, is what would have been alive and active at the time that Jesus was born. But what we've got to add now is we've got to understand that these were components of everyday life for the Old Testament believer, but their fulfillment isn't in and of themselves. Okay, the Mosaic covenant and the law of Moses was never designed to be an end unto itself. It was never designed that the keeping of the law would be the fulfillment of the law. As a matter of fact, we're told explicitly otherwise. There are 613 ordinances in the law of Moses, and a huge big part of the point, I don't want to get derailed here, but a huge big part of the point is no person would ever be capable of doing that, because that isn't what God is after. Okay. God was never after a list of rules and regulations whereby we would stand approved of God. He was looking to make his home inside our hearts. And the first huge step towards that was the incarnation and revelation of the Messiah, the Mashiach Nagid, Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah, the King of Israel. Okay. So now his predecessor is this guy named John. Now, this is a very unusual story. Now, we don't think it's that unusual because we're already familiar with it. But when you recognize when you strip away the familiarity, you recognize that this is a very unusual story. Okay. It was no small thing. There were miraculous circumstances that surrounded the conception and then the birth of John the Baptist. Okay. And there is no doubt that this had local tongues just wagging in and around Jerusalem, where his father Zechariah, who would have been very well known in temple circles, served as a priest. Okay, but then also it would have had tongues wagging in the quote unquote the hill country of Judea, where that family lived. Okay, and so, I mean, because think about this. Like I said, we know the story. First, the angel Gabriel, appears to Zechariah while he is offering incense on the golden altar in the holy place, right? So that's a pretty big darn deal all by itself. An angelic visitation within the holy place. That is, oh my God, it's got to be just stunning. We think about all the other locations in the Bible where angels appear, whether it's to the shepherds or Mary or, other places throughout the scripture where you have angelic appearances. And, one of the first words out of their mouth, is fear not. So this is Gabriel appearing to Zechariah within the holy place in the temple. I mean, that's extraordinary. I heard one teacher say this one time, and I have no reason to doubt him. Neither he nor I can prove it, but there's no reason to think he might not have been right. He basically suggested that Gabriel walked out from behind the veil, right? That he had been in the Holy of Holies and simply stepped out from behind the veil to reveal himself to Zechariah, right? But then he delivers this message to Zechariah that we'll get into in a second. But we're told that Zechariah had a hard time with this message. And as a result of having a hard time with this message, it says that Zechariah is struck dumb, that he cannot speak. Frankly, to prevent him from saying something stupid is what it appears to be the case would be. So then you've got the fact that, so now he's been struck dumb. He's within the holy place. He's inside the holy place. And this is during a time of prayer, right? So you've got people gathered outside the holy place, right? Okay. And undoubtedly they're noticing that, man, he's taking a long time. It doesn't take that long to go in, burn some incense, say a few prayers, and then walk out. So they're wondering what's going on. Why is Zechariah still in the holy place? So they've got to be wondering what's going on, maybe even going so far as to wonder is he dead, right? Did he have some ceremonial uncleanness that therefore God would have struck him dead when he entered the holy place, right? But at any rate, he walks out of the holy place and he emerges onto the porch above the court of the priests, right? And the people are awestruck because they rather quickly perceived that something truly significant had to have happened, and the fact that Zechariah couldn't speak, and they soon realized that he had seen a vision, right? Now we're going to get into this in a minute too. He would have finished his term of service, and then he would have went home. This whole time not being able to speak, so we're presuming he's indicating presuming he is communicating as best he can by like hand gestures, and presumably by writing stuff down that he would grab pen and quill, or whatever the appropriate instrument was at the time, and then write something down, right? So then he gets home, of course, and we are told that both he and Elizabeth are well advanced in years. They are not young anymore, and therefore they are both apparently dealing with the biological challenges that age has on reproduction. Okay, both male and female. But miraculously, they managed to conceive despite what had to be many years of either infertility and or impotence, right? And we don't know for sure how soon the locals discovered that Elizabeth was pregnant, because scripture tells us that she secluded herself, but that could have only provided additional grist for the rumor mill, shall we say, right? So there's all this spectacular stuff going on surrounding the birth, the conception, and the birth of John the Baptist. So meanwhile, in Nazareth, a younger kinsman of Elizabeth named Mary, she has this miraculous visitation, and she's told that she is going to conceive without ever having knowing a man. And then she gets this wild idea. It's actually not a wild idea. It's a very smart idea that she's got to get out of Nazareth. She has to leave Nazareth because she cannot be discovered as being pregnant outside of wedlock. So what does she decide to do? But she decides to travel to Judea and visit her quote unquote cousin, her relative, Elizabeth. Okay. And then, of course, Mary arrives at their home, and it says that prenatal John leaps in the womb of Elizabeth, and Elizabeth becomes filled with the Holy Spirit. So, I mean, this is not ordinary. This is extraordinary. This is extraordinary. Okay. Even for a priest, it's highly probable that Zechariah was in line for the high priesthood. So even for a priest of tremendous reputation, and we're also told that Elizabeth is a daughter of Aaron as well. So she is from a priestly family, not only just a Levitical family, but a priestly family, right? So this is extraordinary. So then, later on, when Elizabeth gives birth, contrary to tradition, she insists on calling him John, the name given her by the angel. Okay. The name given by the angel, right? And to which Zechariah, quote unquote, says he agreed in writing. Okay. So that's why we think he, communicated via writing when he popped out of the holy place, is because we're told later on that is how he helped establish the fact that his son would be called John, right? And then when John is born, oh, lo and behold, Zechariah gets his voice back. So this, I mean, for the forerunner of the Messiah, no ordinary beginning would have been sufficient. It had to be extraordinary, and it absolutely was. Now, let's start to try to put the puzzle together here, because as a forerunner of the Messiah, everything we have talked about, the fulfillment of the Abrahamic Covenant, the fulfillment of the Mosaic Covenant, it's upon us now. Okay. Now, the people at the time, they don't know exactly what to expect, but we have the benefit of looking backwards and being able to see all the pieces kind of come together, so to speak, right? Now, we have previously established, okay, that Jesus was most likely born in an approximately 8 month between in a pardon me in about an 8 month period of time between the early summer of 3 BC and the early winter of 2 BC. And we've done this. I mean, we've actually already established he was born on September 11th, 3 BC, because of Revelation 12:1. But what I'm speaking of here is that if we look at the broad strokes about when he was born during the reign of Augustus Caesar, born during the reign of Herod the Great, born in proximity to the decree that was issued by Augustus Caesar, and these other chronological indicators. This will drop you down to about an 8 month period of time between the early summer of 3 BC and the early winter of 2 BC. And now we're going to add some additional chronological components with regard to the birth of John the Baptist. And this is part of what helps us narrow this down to discovering that he was born on September 11th, 3 BC. But plus, we're getting a two for here. We're getting two for the price of one, because we're also seeing how these environmental components are starting to dovetail together. And oh, by the way, if you're watching this on video, I'm really sorry about the lighting here. I did not close my blinds on my front window, and the very, very, very bright sunlight is shining through that blind and making this picture look really odd. So sorry about that. But at any rate, one of the things we know from Scripture, okay, is the fact that John was conceived and therefore born 6 months before Jesus. Okay. So Luke 2:1 reads, in the 6th month, is it 2? I'm not so sure that is correct. Is that correct? It's funny. I've got this really beautiful graphic here, and off the top of my head, I'm questioning whether that's actually Luke chapter 2, verse 1. Okay. Is that correct? Anyway, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And the angel came in unto her and said, Hail, thou art highly favored. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Okay. So we know that it's 6 months apart. Okay. We know that it's 6 months apart. So John was conceived and then born 6 months before Jesus was. Okay. So if we can determine either or when John was conceived and or when John was born, then that tells us an awful lot more about when Jesus was born. That will help us nail that down. Okay. So in Luke chapter 1, verses 5-7, we read, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. Okay. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth, and they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well advanced in years. Okay. So we've covered a little bit of that already. But what I want to focus in on here is this statement that Zechariah was of the division of Abijah, or the course of Abijah, right? Now, what does that mean? Because we've covered an awful lot of Old Testament background, of Old Testament history, okay? So we know that when Nebuchadnezzar invaded the southern kingdom of Judah, that he destroyed the temple, right? And he took a big chunk of the population captive back to Babylon. Well, that meant the functional destruction of both the hereditary priesthood and the hereditary monarchy, right? And we've already talked about the fact that if you fast forward several hundred years from the Babylonians through the Persians, through the Greeks, to the Maccabean revolt and Jewish independence under the Hasmoneans, that the temple is rebuilt. And while the true hereditary monarchy is not restored, it's not of the line of David. Pardon me, I have to clear my throat here. The true hereditary monarchy was not restored. You've got a de facto hereditary monarchy in the Hasmoneans, but we do know that the hereditary priesthood was restored. Now, when they came back from the Babylonian captivity, one of the things they discovered was that they really only had a remnant, okay, of the priestly families. So what they would have had to have done is they would have had to have reconstructed, so to speak, reconstructed these priestly families. So that is, frankly, that is exactly what they did, is they reconstructed these priestly families and reordered them, quote unquote, reordered them according to 24 divisions. So now the way it worked is if you were a priest and you were of one of these 24 families, one of these 20, and so these are all descendants of Aaron, right? Descendants of Aaron. See, now David was the one who originally did the divisions. So then now, this is several hundred years later, they've returned from the captivity. And even though they only have a remnant, they've learned because of David that once they've restored this to the way it's supposed to be, there's so many priests that not all the priests can minister in the temple at once. So they have to set up a rotation for these 24 divisions, these 24 families, to rotate through temple service through the year. Okay. And the way it would have worked is that each priestly family would have served in the temple, would have ministered in the temple for 2 weeks a year. However, it would have been 1 week at a time. So they would have ministered for 1 week and then 6 months later ministered for another week, at least approximately 6 months later. Now, how the rotation worked was set up according to the religious calendar. Okay. And if we get the time, we'll talk about the religious calendar tonight. If we don't get the time, we'll talk about the religious calendar next week. Okay. Because the rotation of the priestly divisions functioned according to the priestly calendar. Okay. So now let's see if I can't get this up on screen here real quick. It should be this one right here. Here we go. So here are, okay, here are the 24 priestly divisions. All right. You can see their names here. We're not going to bother going through every one of them. That's not really the point. But if you look at this one down right here, if you happen to be watching on video and not just listening on the radio on the internet, the 8th course is the course of Abijah, right? So you got 24 divisions here. You can see them all listed out here. But number 8 is the course of Abijah. So they would have been 8th in the rotation, okay, based upon the religious calendar. Now, one other thing that we need to mention here, it's very, very important, is the fact that, yes, while each family ministered in the temple for 1 week, twice a year, all the priests were required to report to and minister in the temple during the annual feasts. Okay, so there was 7 annual feasts, and the priests would have to show up for these. So, because what this boils down to is that they started the rotation at Passover, because that was the beginning of the religious year. Okay, so they actually began it on the first day of the month of Nisan. Okay, that would the month of Nisan is their the first month of the religious calendar, and therefore on the first of Nisan, that was effectively religious New Year's Day. Ironically, Passover doesn't happen for 2 weeks yet. It's on the full moon. Okay, all the months began on a new moon, so the full moon is guaranteed to be right smack in the middle of the month, 2 weeks later. So Passover begins on Passover 2 weeks later, right? But the ecclesiastical year begins on the first day of Nisan, right? So, and I won't go back there. I won't call up the document. Let me frankly go to a different document now. Share this one with you, because we'll take a look at this. You can see the breakdown here of how this would have worked, right? So, what I've got set out here is I've got the Hebrew month, I've got our equivalent month, and then which division would have served, and then for how long, right? Okay. So, and then so here is family number one. Here's family number two. So that's week one, family one, week two, family two. Now, week 3 and 4, because like I just said, right, this began on the first of the month, but the Feast of Passover is going to show up 2 weeks later, right? Okay. And all priests are required to minister during the annual festivals, the annual feasts. So week one, family one, week two, family two, weeks 3 and 4, all of the priests would have been required to minister, right? So then week 5 is actually family 3, week 6 is actually family 4, week 7 is actually family 5, week 8 is family 6, week 9 is family 7. Then, oh, whoops, lo and behold, another festival gets in our way. So again, so week 10 would be all of the priests ministering. And then finally, in week 11 of the religious year, of the ecclesiastical year, you would have had the 8th family, the 8th division, the Course of Abijah, serving in the temple. Okay. Now, like I've said, we've already established from other chronological indicators that Jesus was most likely born in the fall of 3 BC, right? Well, if we simply do the math, right? If he was born in the fall of 3 BC, and for the moment, let's treat it as a hypothesis. I mean, we've pretty much already established it, but let's treat it as a hypothesis for a moment. Okay. If Jesus was born in the fall of 3 BC, that means, and it was the month of September, then that means he was conceived in the month of December of 4 BC. Okay. And then if John is 6 months older, that means he was conceived 6 months before Jesus. So if Jesus was conceived in December of 4 BC, then hypothetically, John should have been born 6 months earlier. And if we count backwards, that's from December, we go November, October, September, August, July, June. That's 6 months earlier. That means John the Baptist should have been conceived in June of 4 BC. So now, so like I said, treat it as a hypothesis for the moment, and let's find out if our additional evidence now lines up. Okay, because I just ran you through this chronology of the divisions of priestly service in the temple in 4 BC. And then what we can do, see, is all we've got to do is grab an astronomy program, right? And a good calendar, and we can work backwards and find out exactly when these things occurred, because the like I said, the new month, every new month began on a new moon, right? The Feast of Passover began on a full moon. The Feast of Passover was always on the first full moon after the vernal equinox. So, see, these are all chronological indicators that tell us that we can actually pinpoint this, right? A lot of people would try to tell you, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't really know. Well, yeah, we kind of can. We may not be able to say like day and hour for John, but we pretty much can say day and hour for Jesus, right? So all we're doing here now is looking at additional evidence to see how much evidence corroborates our theory, okay? Because I think I've talked about this before. If I haven't, let me repeat it now very briefly, okay? Doing historical research and investigating historical evidence is very, very much like trying to prove something in a court of law. Specifically, it's like trying to prove a cold case, because in a cold case, that's because all of the witnesses are not available anymore. The apparent crime was long enough ago that the victim, the perpetrator, the witnesses, everybody, can't be reached. There's no eyewitness testimony anymore. Therefore, cold cases are solved exclusively by circumstantial evidence. Okay. Now, we've all watched way too much television, so we think that the term circumstantial evidence is a dirty word, that you can't use circumstantial evidence to prove a case, when that's actually not true. Cold cases are proven exclusively by circumstantial evidence. It depends upon the quantity and quality of the evidence. Yeah, if you've only got one or two pieces of circumstantial evidence and it's not very good circumstantial evidence, yeah, then you're not proving very much. But if you've got a lot of cross-referenced information that all points you in the same direction, that's a completely different story. So, as I said, if we take our other indicators, if we take the reign of Augustus, if we take the reign of Herod, if we take the lunar eclipse that tells us approximately when Herod died, and plug that into the picture, right? That Herod died in early 1 BC, because the lunar eclipse that is referenced by Josephus occurred on January 9th and or 10th of 1 BC. And then Herod died something along the order of 4 weeks later, 2 to 4 to maybe 6 weeks later is when Herod died, right? Plus, we look at when Augustus Caesar was proclaimed Pater Patriae by the Roman Senate in February of 2 BC, and the fact that there was an edict, okay, that went out that required an empire-wide registration of notable citizens that Joseph and Mary would have been, right, to swear an oath of allegiance. So there had to be enough time to collect the signatures, quote unquote, and then get them back to Rome in time for the Senate to declare Augustus Pater Patriae, father of the country, at the Festival of Concordia in February of 2 BC. So if you back up to the early summer of 3 BC is when this edict would have been sent out, right? Plus, like I said, we do have Revelation 12:1, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and that is a plus the crown of 12 stars on her head. And we know that occurred on September 11th of 3 BC, and that's a highly unusual astronomical sign that only occurs roughly every 2,000 years. But oh yeah, it's just a coincidence that it happened to occur on September 11th of 3 BC, right smack dab in the middle of our theoretical time frame, right? If we're working with this as a hypothesis, like I said, it fits. It drops right in where we need it to, right? And no one's forcing anything here. This is all just dropping in. And oh yeah, just a coincidence, and we'll talk about this more, especially next week when we talk more about the religious calendar. Oh yeah, that day just happened to be a religious feast day in the Hebrew calendar. It also happened to be their civil new year, the day they crown their kings, or at least the day they reckon their regnal reigns, okay? Their regnal years. So yeah, these are not coincidences. These are all things that are falling together piece by piece. And the fact that the Bible actually speaks quite clearly of this kind of evidence, that these are the things, frankly, it's these kind of things that if you had been an observant Jew under the Old Testament, when Jesus showed up, it should have been easy. That's part of why it's so stunning that they rejected their own Messiah and didn't recognize their own Messiah, is the fact that you've got so many conspicuous indicators that God has planned for in advance to help them recognize their own Messiah. So anyway, back to the priestly divisions here. We know by these other indicators that if Jesus was born in September, then John had to have been born in March. Okay. If Jesus was conceived in December, then John had to be conceived in June, right? So now the logical question is, does the religious calendar and the service of these priestly divisions, does that line up, or is it completely off? Right? Because if it's completely off, then we got a problem. We've got to go back to the drawing board and start again and re-examine our evidence. But if it lines up, now we have another piece of corroborating evidence. So again, take a look at the chart here. Week 1 of the religious year in 4 BC would have been the equivalent of the final week of March, March 24th to 31st, and the first family would have served that week. Week 2 was the first week of April, family 2. Weeks 3 and 4 would have been weeks 2 and 3 of April. And then that would have been when all of the priests served in the temple. The 5th religious week would have been essentially the final week of April, and that's when you would have had the third family. Then week 6 would have been essentially the first week of May. The 7th week is the second week of May. The 8th week is the third week of May. The 9th week is the 4th week of May. And of course, that's not absolutely precise because, it's not an exact 7-day, lining up with the numbers on the calendar. But then you get to week number 10 and you get another festival. And that would have been the Feast of Weeks, right? Pentecost. And that would have occurred between May 26th. The service of all the priests would have occurred between May 26th and June 4th, which means Zechariah would have been there for this occasion. Okay, he would have already been there because all priests were required to serve. And also I should tell everybody, Zechariah only lived about maybe 6 miles from the temple. So it's not a difficult thing for him to get there. It's an easy couple hours walk for him to get where he needs to go, right? So then week 10, the first week of the Hebrew month of Sivan, essentially the first week of June, all of the priests are serving. Then the majority of the priests are released and they go home, but the division of Abijah is required to remain because it's their week of service in effectively the second week of June. There we go. The second week of June. So it's the second week of June between June 4th and June 11th of 4 BC is when Zechariah was ministering in the temple. and he would have had this visitation from the angel Gabriel, right? Then he's struck mute and then he goes home. But now put it in context. Go back to what I said about what an amazing story this is, and the fact that this is really spectacular. The fact that Zechariah and Elizabeth were both well advanced in years, that Elizabeth had been barren, that they had never had a child, that they had been praying for a child. Zechariah is in his priestly service, and the angel appears to him and says, your prayers have been heard. Your prayers have been answered. You're going to have a son. You're going to name him John. And then, so what does that do? You have to think about it. What would that mean? Come on, I'm 60 years old, right? If I was 60 years old and my wife is, essentially the same age as me, and we've never had kids, and we've wanted kids our entire life, and then I get an angelic visitation that tells me, hey, you're going to have a kid, right? Well, what is Zechariah going to do when he gets home, right? Now, the irony is he had to we don't know when during his week of service that this occurred. Was it the first day, in the middle, the last day? We don't know. He had to finish his week of service, and then he's got to go home and tell Elizabeth, right? Now, this is some pretty fantastic stuff, right? So you do have to wonder, if he tells Elizabeth, what is she going to think? Because we've got the example of Abraham and Isaac all the way back in the Old Testament, a very, very similar circumstance. And you have a Christophany, okay, happen on that occasion. A theophany happens on that occasion. The pre-incarnate Christ, appears to Abraham and Abraham and Sarah, and says, oh yeah, about a year from now, according to the time of life, you're going to have a child, right? And Sarah's response is to laugh in his face. Okay. It's so incredulous to her that she goes, ha ha, yeah, right, sure. yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. That's going to happen. Right. That doesn't appear to be how Elizabeth reacted. Okay. Zechariah goes home and apparently tells Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, it doesn't tell us how she reacted, but she didn't laugh. I would think we would be told that if her reaction would have been like Sarah, right? And then, of course, we have to be polite, but I wonder what Zechariah and Elizabeth would have been doing later that evening. Okay. Nature would have taken its course, and then we have this. Frankly, it's got to be a miraculous conception in order for Elizabeth to conceive. But that makes complete sense with John the Baptist because of the fact that he is the forerunner of the Messiah. But all of that to say that now we have an additional piece of information, okay, that absolutely fits with all of our other chronological information thus far, right? All of the other indicators tend to indicate that John should have been conceived essentially in June of 4 BC. And then when we look at the chronological indicator that we are given, that we are told Zechariah served during the division of Abijah, the course of Abijah, and we simply follow the biblical prescription for when these priestly families would have ministered in the temple, we discover that, yep, he ministered in early June, which means he would have had almost the last 3 weeks of June to walk home and then fellowship with Elizabeth, shall we say. Okay. And the fact that they conceived and they had John the Baptist. So there you have it. You have another piece of stunning evidence that fits exactly like we would hope, right? And like I've said many times, we're not trying to force this. We need the evidence to speak for itself. Okay, we need to allow the evidence to speak for itself, not try to force it. But we haven't been forcing it at all here. All we're doing is looking at the different pieces of evidence, and they are lining up very, very, very precisely. all indicating that Jesus was born in the fall of 3 BC. So that's going to wrap it up for this episode of God Save the King. I want to thank you for joining me. Again, you can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told radio network. There are many different ways to listen to the Truth Be Told radio network, my show, as well as many other great shows on TBTRN. You can go to their website, which is truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. You can listen on your Android app on your phone. You can listen on the MyTuner app, the Wi-Fi radio app, the TuneIn radio app on any smart device. And of course, that includes Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. Last but not least, you can dial in and you can listen at 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977. Just simply dial in and listen on your phone. And last but not least, my opinions that I share here on my show, God Save the King, are not necessarily the opinions of the Truth Be Told radio network. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tim Kies, GodSaveTheKing.org. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you again next week.